Welcome everyone to today's research seminar. We are honored to have Dr. Scott Brown with us, an established scholar in politics and international relations at the University of Dundee from Scotland. Dr. Brown has made significant contributions to the field of international relations, particularly in the areas of strategic triangle of Europe, US, China relations. Dr. Brown is a prolific researcher with an impressive publication record, including a monograph, Power, Perception, and Foreign Policy Making, US and Europe Responses to the Rise of China, published by Routledge in 2018, and the numerous papers published in the world-leading journals such as the China Quarterly. Scott is currently visiting fellow at the ANU's Australian Centre on China in the World. We appreciate that Scott came to visit us during his fellowship at ANU. Without further ado, let's welcome Scott to give us a talk on hegemonic ordering and tech competition, critical technologies, supply chains, and weaponized interdependence in East Asia. Scott, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Gloria. And thank you, everyone, for coming along today. I greatly appreciate you taking your time out of your schedule, sitting on such a beautiful day, but I guess you guys are used to that. And thanks to Chantal for organizing all of this today. So yeah, I'm from Dundee, and I've started putting maps on my presentations because usually people ask where Dundee is in Scotland. But Edinburgh is the more well-known one, but we're a bit further up the east coast where it's a bit sunnier and people are nicer. So I've been it's the Brisbane of Scotland, really, I think is the answer. Edinburgh, Sydney, you know, kind of place where a lot of tourists, and it's nice to visit, but not where you want to hang out too long. So yeah, yeah, this is my current project at the China and the World Centre. I've been working on it over the summer. My plan originally, when I applied for the fellowship, was the paper completely finished when I arrived, and I just had a nice time. Didn't work out that way, so I've been actually hard at work over the past 6 or 7 weeks. So this is kind of a work in progress with where I am. So the ideas are still developing, and hopefully we can have a good chat about that today. So yeah, I'll talk for a bit. In Scotland, we call it blethering. It's a lot talk for a long time without necessarily making a lot of sense. So I might blether for a bit today. But when I've been starting to talk to people about what I'm working on recently in particular technology, a lot of people bring up this book, Ghost Fleet, which was produced back in 2015, and I did read it at the time. It was published even though that wasn't my central focus. If you haven't read Ghost Fleet, the authors, Singer and Cole, are both sort of think tank academic type people, and they wrote this as a near future science fiction. But the twist is that all the technology that China uses to launch its war against the US already exists. So the book, although it's a work of fiction, has like 400 footnotes where they like show examples of the existing technology and so on. And it got a lot of attention, particularly from a lot of military people in the US. They read this book and started like giving book reviews and so on, giving public comments, and it kind of led into the sort of public political discourse in the US for a while about, you know, any tech development involving China. It's like, oh, Ghost Fleet, this is part of China's strategy. So yeah, I was already kind of thinking about technology, particularly dual-use export controls during my PhD. It's only more recently I've started shifting over to looking at technology policy in particular. So I'll set out what I'm trying to do at the moment to get what today's presentation will cover. What I've tried to do in my previous work is like I've always been interested in the sort of big picture questions of IR, but trying to connect them with what's happening sort of in a foreign policy analysis kind of perspective, what do decision makers do and think. And for this, I'm looking at Huawei semiconductors and supply chains, and I'm kind of merging two of my recent projects to give a little bit of context there as well. And I think that this case has implications for hegemonic contestation between the US and China, particularly in East Asia at the moment. So to situate my current project, the title just maps onto the paper I'm currently working on at the centre. As a little bit of self-promotion, my forthcoming article, which should be online next month, is about applying securitization theory to the digital economy. And I looked at Huawei and TikTok in the US and the EU and how the digital economy has become increasingly securitized. And then the middle paper, co-authored with Alistair Young at Georgia Tech, which is a bit more about the EU's emergence as an actor in this space. And our contribution there is trying to separate out geopoliticization from securitization, because we think in the literature, the two terms are starting to be used quite interchangeably. And we don't think that's a useful way of thinking about these things. We think there's important processes that are going on different in there. So I draw a little bit on that paper just for some context. So yeah, over the past couple of years, I've started to look a bit more at the role of technology in these relationships, mostly from the US and the EU's perspective. And when I say EU, I still include the UK. It's really Europe, or the EU 27 plus the UK. But as a Remainer who's still in denial 8 years after the referendum, unfortunately, I still do this. But so there's been a lot of work on the chip war. But so far, what I find interesting in the literature is that it's either quite technically focused on the supply chains and the technologies that are in play and the processes that are going on, or they tend to be geopolitically focused, but just between the US and China predominantly, and looking at this as a dyad and not really thinking about order and transitions and processes going on there. There's been a lot of really interesting work on hegemony and hierarchy and order and recently, but they haven't used this case yet to really test these relationships. So that's why I kind of wanted to do this paper was when I'm reading this stuff and looking at not just the narratives, the policies, to me, it kind of jumps out from the evidence that there's something bigger going on here. Like we're maybe only at the start of the process of seeing this shift, but it definitely plays into wider processes. So since I pitched, of course, is the class, I'm sure you've all had this experience, you come up with an idea and you pitch it and then someone publishes a paper that's kind of close to your work while you're working on the project. Rowan Kim did a really interesting paper on this where they look at the positions of different actors, but they just frame it in terms of the economic security nexus. And then they talk about US-China hegemony, but it's just sort of like one up, one down, as if they're the only two actors that really determine the outcomes, and they don't really have a theory of hegemony. So none of this literature is bad in any way. What I'm just trying to do is shine a light on it from a different perspective from everyone else and a draw on this literature. So that's where I'm trying to come in. So the research question for the paper, I tried to keep it quite simple, was how does the chip war or the contestation over semiconductors and supply chains impact upon hegemonic order in East Asia? And the East Asia focus is quite deliberate because of the fact that the geography matters of where the main semiconductor production is actually happening in East Asia and how that creates particular choke points that have implications for all or for the world, really. So I break down into 3 specific questions that I just used to order the paper. I think a lot of literature undervalues the significance of technological interdependence. Like the really technical papers get into this, but the geopolitical ones don't really emphasize technological independence enough, I don't think. I think the US and China are both trying to use strategies of regional coalition building because it's not just about material power. They need the other actors in the region to buy into their preferred system. And I'll explain why I think that's the case later on. But I also tried to look at the situation in terms of the US and China, although we see this as competition and rivalry, they are both still trying to collaborate, and particularly in some areas of science and technology, and they're trying to work out how to balance this as well. But I think there are challenges. So yeah, the argument's fairly straightforward at basic levels. I think, yeah, there is something going on here. This contestation matters, not just for technology policy or for industrial policy, but more broadly in terms of how the US and China are going to be able to establish their preferred order in East Asia at the moment. And I kind of I'll come back to this in a second, it might be a bit more, it might make us a bit more sense, but China's driven by the innovation imperative, where if it wants to continue its trajectory, it's not just about, it's not simply just about having numerically a stronger military than the US. It's actual innovation and the ability to use asymmetric methods of defeating the US. Not just militarily, but economically leaping ahead as well. So that conditions the relationship and it produces particular responses from the US. I'll break these down. And then the US, some of the literature on the chip war has mostly focused just on the security perspective, not the ordering that the US is trying to do. And there's a tug of war kind of going on between the US and China with respect to how they're using the established rules of the international trade system to defend what they're doing to each other in semiconductor trades. But for both of them, it requires the support of middle powers, which I think in particular hasn't been looked at enough in the literature. And I think that the middle powers are kind of acting more or less in terms of the model of hegemonic order I'm using to explain. The middle powers are mostly acting in accordance with their expectations. But one of the things that I found interesting in the paper, I was actually going to leave the European Union out of the equation because I'm doing it in other projects. But actually, the EU has played a fairly significant role in how this has played out recently, particularly in terms of providing a framework that has allowed the US to legitimize what it's doing, particularly using de-risking rather than decoupling strategy. So I'll kind of talk about the role of the EU. And then China's response plays into this as well in terms of it has tried to build a coalition around its preferred order for the trade regime in East Asia. And it's tried to use the World Trade Organization's existing rules to defend its interests rather than challenge them, which I think has been kind of interesting. But then, and I'll come back to weaponization as well. So that's kind of the broad scope of it. So in terms of hegemonic ordering, in my past work, I've used power transition theory and mostly critiqued power transition theory for its limitations. But what I didn't do in that work was go on to have an alternative theory of hegemony. I was just sort of critiquing power transition theory. So a couple of years ago, well before I was applying for this, I read Beverly Lope's work, which is derived from the English school and builds on Ian Clarke's work in particular. And she devises or sets up a model of regional hegemony, which is focused around the fact that the hierarchy is increasingly complex due to cross-cutting issue areas, and that there are dynamics of both collaboration and competition between the two dominant or the dominant power and its nearest challenger in terms of setting up contestation. So when I read this a while back, I was like, this actually sounds a lot more like what I'm seeing when I look at the evidence between the US and China. And so things started to fall in place last year, and then I saw the opportunity at the China Center, knew that Beverly was there, and wrote to her, and that's how I've ended up working on this project. So the idea here is really to look at not just material power, but also the social basis of hegemony as well, and the fact that whoever is presenting a preferred hegemonic order has to have social legitimization by other powers in the region in order for those preferences to be advanced. And I think that's what we're seeing between the US and China in the semiconductor supply chain and how they've tried to co-opt other actors into their preferred system. So yeah, that's kind of cut off, but it's distinct from the other sort of logics of hegemony. Lope's work does a really good literature review of like the development of thinking about hegemony in the IR theory literature. So I'm not going to, we can come back to this later, but I just basically take her model as my starting point, but I present it because I guess it's not familiar to most. The other work that I'm drawing on, and again, these are two ANU scholars. I didn't pick it just because of that, but it has been helpful being there and talking to them about this. But this paper is published in International Affairs back in 2018 about the innovation imperative. And I think it's quite useful because they set out a series of expectations about how states will respond when there is a state that is dominant politically, economically, militarily, and technologically. And they argue that most theories of hegemony and power transition acknowledge the role of technology, but don't really say how it conditions behavior. So they set up this idea that for middle-income countries that want to continue on a trajectory towards great power status or regional or global hegemony, at some point they need to surpass the dominant power in terms of technological innovation. They need to be able to acquire new technology produce their own and not just be dependent on other actors, and produce better quality technology. So this is what they see this as an important aspect of being able to ascend in the international arena. The rising power does this. It's treated as a background condition. It's like if there's a rising power, it does this because that's what it needs to do. But the behavior of the rising state is always going to produce a response from the dominant state. It's not just going to allow its challenger to surpass it. So there are two effects of the rising power behavior on the dominant power. One is that it creates negative security externalities. Quite simply, their security is compromised by the fact that this other state is innovating, is acquiring technology that can be put to use against it economically or militarily. And then the other one, and I think this is their particular contribution that isn't recognized elsewhere in the literature on technology and certain positions, is the negative order externalities. The behavior of the rising power often challenges the preferred interest. So the case they use is intellectual property. So the US is dominant in terms of technological innovation. It uses the intellectual property regime to try and protect its firms and its technological edge. The rising power will often use illicit means, such as industrial espionage, to get that knowledge, and then through processes of reverse engineering or just simply co-opting the technology, put that into practice for its own national interests. So as I'll go on to explain a little bit, I think that's quite clearly what's happening in the semiconductor realm. But we see elements of China doing both. It is using industrial espionage to get the technology, but then it's trying to use the World Trade Organization rules to keep semiconductor trade open and to remove the US's export controls the US has imposed in recent years. So the general security response to the dominant power, quite the best thing it can do is cut off access to leading edge technology so that the rising country can't use that technology against it. It can't use that as a basis for its own innovation. Order response is usually to defend and strengthen the rules and then punish violations. And that links into what the EU has been doing. I'll come back to that as well. So I think this maps on quite well to what we're already seeing in the US-China relationship in technology. So I tried to build this in as another layer of what I'm looking at in the contestation. And the kind of third part of my approach, and I'll try and show how to link these together, is that like interdependence and technological interdependence is nothing new. And we know fine well in bilateral relationships, interdependence is weaponized bilaterally where one state will use disadvantage. But I think if you're not familiar with Farrell and Newman's work, this was a paper 5 years ago that presented, based on their previous work on the new interdependence, this idea that there's a new form of weaponizing interdependence, which isn't just about the bilateral relationship. It's about the position of a state in global economic networks. And that can include the internet as a form of economic network as well, and also relevant supply chains. So it's about structural position. So if you're in control of a particular hub, say semiconductor production of the actual basic chips, then you have the capacity to weaponize that by stopping others from getting access. The US is the dominant power in terms of intellectual property development of the most advanced chips. So that serves as a hub that's firms, particularly in California, cut off access to that, and that's weaponizing your position in the structure. Because it doesn't just have effects on China, it has effects on other countries as well, which is a way that you can coerce them to comply with what you want. So I think this better captures what's going on in the semiconductor or the chip war as well. It's not just about the material resources, it's about access to information, access to markets as well, and position within critical infrastructure, which is where Huawei comes in a few minutes. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I'll occasionally refer to the panopticon effect and then the choke point effect, and we can kind of go through that. So the panopticon is kind of like your ability to surveil everything that's happening in a particular network. And then choke point is like when the Ever Given got stuck and stopped trade for a few weeks back in 2021. Your ability to cut off someone's access has negative implications for them. So this, I think, the threat of weaponized interdependence is looked at in a few of the contributions to literature so far, but it's mostly just kind of conventional approaches to interdependence, where they're looking at bilateral between the US and China. And I don't think there's enough appreciation for what's actually going on more widely here. So, yeah, the technology will give China the capacity eventually to directly militarily challenge the US, but that's not the most immediate concern for the US and its allies. First is China, because of its position in the global semiconductor supply chain, has the ability to threaten the US and its allies' access to raw materials just now. So if China decides to impose export controls there, they can no longer make the chips that they need for all of their technologies. And the other one is, going back to Ghost Fleet, the concern that any technology built in China might have access through back doors that the PRC built and the PLA, if they chose to, could exploit. And there's been publicly available reports that support this. Like Vodafone themselves did an industry analysis and discovered, yeah, they think there were backdoor access in Huawei chips. So this is the concern, is that if our digital economy is built on technology that is made in China by Chinese companies, then we might give the Chinese government a backdoor into our critical infrastructure networks, allow them to surveil sensitive data or to launch cyber attacks or critical infrastructure. And for my purposes, I'm not trying to say that this is definitely what's happening, but it's the perception that these things could happen is what's driving policymakers at the moment. Enough policymakers seem to believe this is a viable threat and that they're acting on this basis. So this is how I kind of see this working together. It's not like a formal model, but the states exist within a particular regional hegemonic order. There are different preferences, different processes going on as well, because different policy domains matter simultaneously. And what I think is interesting about the technology domain is that it cross-cuts military and economic, and it's difficult to separate them there as well. So state behavior for China, they're driven by the innovation imperative, and other actors are driven in response to what China's doing on that basis. And they're also driven by weaponized interdependence. And these concerns also then impact how they treat interdependent networks, what policies they make around supply chains and digital infrastructure. So there's the threats that they perceive shape their behavior, but it also shapes their preferences for the hegemonic order as well. So what's happening at a very technical level has implications for how they're pursuing dominant, or the US and China pursuing dominance of the regime. So I focus on a few actors here. The US, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. These have set up a group that's sometimes called the Fab Four, but out of respect for the peoples, we're not calling the Fab Four. They have called it Chip Four, but like a lot of the media calls it the Fab Four because of the obvious pop culture references, but I'll stick to Chip Four. China, obviously, as well, and then the EU, and in particular Netherlands, which I'll come back to in a little bit. So one of the most obvious kind of justification for my case selection here is that economically, these are the most important semiconductor suppliers by quite far. The US is the dominant power in the global supply chain, but position in terms of like economic power here isn't the only thing that matters. Because the US in the 1980s and 1990s allowed for, or the firms pursued decentralization, particularly of fabrication, to East Asia in order to essentially maximize their profits. They did this without any really concern for what this meant in terms of security long term. There was no kind of real effort to think long term about this. So now we do have a very much regionally focused global supply chain of semiconductors, and it's all concentrated in East Asia, particularly amongst these countries. So market position of the US is not being challenged here. That's not really what it's about. It's not the US's overall military power, but it's the supply chains that matter. And we've already seen an example of what happens when semiconductor production slows down during COVID-19, because of the disruptions to supply chains during that, and unavailability of labour, lockdowns in China, etc. Semiconductor production slowed down, and you couldn't buy new cars for a period of time. It was very difficult. Games console, for anyone who has young kids, were scarce for a period of time, which wasn't great in lockdown. We weren't getting out and about. So the value chain, you can see here, like the US sits at the top, UK getting in some representation there, thanks to ARM architecture. But the countries that I'm focusing on are the ones that are accumulating most of the global value as well. But because it's been decentralized, different countries have different roles to play in the various processes, which makes for some really interesting applications, as I'll hopefully come back to. I told you I was going to blather, and I'm halfway through my time and not too far. So I think China has become a lot more direct about what its technology ambitions are for in terms of economic development and military development, but also just kind of the prestige of China on the global stage. So, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to spend too much time here, but they are talking about technology in relation to their defense capability a lot more directly than they were before Xi came to power. But that was back in June at the Science and Technology. So kind of the way that I've seen US policymakers in particular looking at this is that the innovation drive is not just about China being able to defend itself or to restore its economy, but it's actually using this as a means to establish regional dominance and potentially push the US out of the region as well. And it not only has the capacity to weaponize these independent relationships, but increasingly the US perceives it as having the will to do so as well. There was an interview with the Department of Commerce Secretary, whose name has just escaped me. It was in the Wall Street Journal on Monday, and he was being asked about cybersecurity attacks, what percentage these turn out, or they think attribution is linked to China or actors in China, even if not state affiliated. And he said the vast majority of them, increasingly, it's China that is using these to for industrial espionage, pushing US firms, but also the US state as well. So there's a lot of accusations around these kind of things. So this kind of the increased perception that China is already weaponizing interdependent technological relationships has changed the behavior of these other actors who previously, like even, up until 2018, there was still this lingering sort of, even if in other domains, the engagement strategy, particularly for the US, was like on the way out. In technology, there was still a belief that they could still bind China in. China had reason to play by the rules of the game, and that they could alter China's behavior. That seems to have changed, and the ability, or previously, particularly in the US and EU, tech firms did quite well in convincing the government that they could handle the security risks themselves. Increasingly, governments don't seem to believe that anymore. And that's what I don't have in the paper is government-firm relations. I don't really look into that too much because it'd just be another layer of complexity. And there, I'll talk a little bit about firms. So like in my other work, I've looked at specifically securitization, digital sector and digital economy, and then Rowan Kim as well. So there's kind of there. So the chip war all kind of started with Huawei's technology in the US. I won't spend them, is everyone kind of familiar with what happened in that space? So but in 2018, the US government started very publicly talking about Huawei as a threat to national security in the US, and also started trying to lobby European allies first on this. Australia, of course, was the first country to impose a ban on Huawei's equipment in its 5G core network. But European governments, because of the pushback of their firms, and in some cases just the government's disposition towards China at the time, didn't pick up on this. But the European Commission did. The European Commission, which up until about 2016, when it came to China, left it to the member states and just focused on improving the trade relationship. The Commission over the past 6 or 7 years has become a lot more proactive and explicitly tried to carve out a role as a geopolitical actor in its own right and to elevate the EU in that space. So the Commission sides with the US and starts pushing, then there's a bunch of developments. But the most important one was in May 2019 when Trump passed his first executive order, which meant that Huawei's technologies could no longer be used in the US's 5G core network, specifically because it is perceived as a security threat. Now, the executive order doesn't name Huawei or China. They talk about high-risk vendors, but the Department of Commerce immediately puts Huawei and a few other Chinese firms on the entity list, which meant US suppliers of telecoms no longer could buy in Huawei's technology, specifically because they thought the technology was going to be used as a backdoor to compromise US security. So this expands over time, and this is where we get into the semiconductor war, because the US administration did not think that excluding Huawei's technology from its digital infrastructure was enough. They decided that what they had to do was to stop Huawei and broader Chinese technological development. How they were going to do that was by imposing export restrictions on US technology or design software going to China at all. And this expands over time, and the export restrictions have even been expanded this year by the Biden administration. And at this point, Huawei is entirely out of the US consumer space as well, like down to handsets and stuff. So in the paper, I kind of like look at examples of where the discourse is very explicit about this being threats of weaponized interdependence and like specific references to choke point and the capacity of the Chinese state to surveil what's going on in the US. So I won't kind of go through all these. Now in the EU, a number of member states have moved to ban Huawei, and some of them have gone as far as ordering their telecoms providers to rip out Huawei technology and replace it. And that's been controversial because the European governments have not ponied up to cover the cost of that, whereas in the US, the government did. Germany, just at the end of July, finally announced its decision to remove Huawei's from its 5G network. The only two countries that have been explicit that they will continue to use Huawei are Austria and Hungary. And I'm sure there's a joke about empire in there somewhere, but I can't figure it out. So if anyone has any ideas how I can turn that into a joke, then I'd be really keen. And this is from a project with Alistair, where we're looking at propensity to de-risk relations and whether that translates. And as you'd expect, the countries that are most in favor of de-risking economic ties are the ones that have gone furthest on that. France is an interesting outlier because up until this year with electric vehicle stuff and China's retaliation yesterday on dairy exports to China in particular, France was very much about deepening France's economic relationship with China, but also did rip out Huawei technology. Netherlands is kind of unusual here because we coded it on the basis of public announcements, like by the government or their intelligence agencies. There's been media reports that Netherlands have privately told their telecoms companies to quietly take out Huawei's 5G technology, but they've never publicly announced that. So we put it there, but they are a rip and replace country, if those reports are believed. So yeah, this is just kind of more like talking through the actual mechanisms of what the US has done and how it represents weaponization of interdependence. So the US's response to the threat of weaponization of interdependence has been to weaponize its position strategically against China, right? So it's not just one directional of China. The US is doing this in response as well. So, and the US has been quite explicit more recently that this isn't just about particular firms. It's about slowing down China's technological development. And the Biden administration now, the entity list was kind of used as the basis, but it's essentially a countrywide ban. It used to be firms and it used to be about high-risk vendors, and it was on a case-by-case basis, but now it's just you cannot sell certain semiconductor technologies to China. And what the US has tried to do, and I'll come back to this, is that it's tried to extend its jurisdiction over firms based in other countries if they use American components and say, essentially a form of secondary sanctions, say, you cannot sell that to China if you use our technology, we'll stop selling you technology or we'll impose export, official export controls. So China has responded to this weaponization of independence with much more clearly threatening to do the same. China is really important for the production of gallium and germanium, two key materials in the production of semiconductors. And they've put in place the regulatory framework to stop exports, particularly to the US, but they haven't actually followed through and implemented a ban yet. But they're trying to signal quite clearly to the US, if you're going down the path of export controls and choking off our technology, we're willing to do the same as well. At the moment, it seems like they haven't, because it would be bad news for China's economy if they actually did go through this, and they'd expect massive retaliations in return. But they're at least saying sort of like, two can play that game. But China has also tried to reach out to, initially through firms, but also with states, particularly in East Asia, and ones that haven't included Malaysia and Singapore. But Roe and Kim cover those, so I kind of just refer to their coverage, because they're not significant players. Like in the supply chain, they're becoming more important, but they're not of equal importance. So I didn't want to crowd out my paper. But particularly with South Korea, China actually got quite a lot of buy-in to its defense of an open trade system for semiconductors. And this led to the idea, like South Korea has conventionally had this looking to China for economic stability, looking to the US for security. And it tried to do this by looking across in the semiconductor domain as well. I'll come back to that a little bit later and why I think South Korea has now shifted away. But China started trying to strike up deals because it wanted to maintain access to advanced technologies via other countries and via other firms as well, and try to, the approach was to put a lot of emphasis on, open trade being consistent with current rules, right? And it was good for everybody's growth. A lot of the deployment of win-win cooperation, as we're used to in China's foreign policy. So yeah, then kind of moving through and talking about weaponization of semiconductors in particular, and how it's both a reaction to the threat of weaponization of independence, and then coming in as well. But for both the US and China, I think what we're seeing is an increased willingness to weaponize supply chains in this domain in order to get what they want. But then, as I said, I think it's important to look at what the middle powers are doing, because they need to, firstly, because they are key hubs in the supply chains themselves, and the decisions they make will have an impact on the US or China. But they also serve to legitimize the order by buying into agreements, say, like the Chip 4 alliance hasn't really produced, they've had one meeting or something last year, and they've kind of said, we're going to work on supply chain resilience with because we're like-minded countries and so on. But I think that's important symbolic signaling of what they're trying to achieve and what they think is legitimate. In Japan, as you'd maybe expect, very quickly, closely aligned with the US's position, implemented a number of policy changes that would boost its own semiconductor production. Japan used to be a lot more important to global semiconductors back in the 80s. It's declined significantly, but it does have some important role in research and development in particular. So, and then the Economic Security Protection Act of 2022 also imposed advanced technology exports to China, whereas previously a number of Japanese firms, China was a big market for them. So in a number of senses, Japan and the other countries have acted against the economic interests of their own firms in order to align with the US and to promote national security. So these are just some more things. What I think has been interesting, and this will come back to where I'm talking the role of the EU, is Japan was quite explicit they didn't want to decouple economically from China. And when the Trump administration used to push this, Japan just was not buying into it at all. And even now, even though the Biden administration has shifted to talking about de-risking, Japan is quite clear to signal to China that it doesn't want wider economic decoupling, and it continues to use this. So even when it supports like the G7 on de-risking and working on semiconductors, they're also signaling to China that this is not economic decoupling, and that Japan still sees value in economic trade with China. I've kind of talked a lot about South Korea's position here, and Roe and Kim called this a hedging strategy. I think the developments that Roe and Kim don't capture more recently show that South Korea is actually moving to align more with the US, and not directly because of US pressure, but because of China's pressure on South Korea. They've tried to push Korea into aligning more closely with China. I think have actually had the opposite effect and pushed them away. And I think we've seen that with the statement last year. And also South Korea has become a bit more willing to talk about the Chip 4. Some lingering issue, obviously, like the relationship between South Korea and Japan, the historical context there still matters, which has been seen by some as why the Chip 4 hasn't progressed. But yeah, China publicly stated last year, an official said that South Korea was essentially trying to decouple from China and they were essentially going to regret it. And China's ambassador to South Korea was summoned for that language. And what we've seen then, in terms of the government statements, is that South Korea seems to be aligning much more with the US's position in response to these. And then Taiwan, Taiwan's close alignment, and arguably I think Taiwan is the most important country geographically in terms of supply chain. TSMC is the world's largest and most advanced foundry. A foundry is a fabricator that takes chip designs from any company it wants to and builds them to specification. So imports a lot of raw materials from China, produces these into semiconductors that are then off to the more advanced firms that design them. So, you know, back when semiconductor production started in the 1950s, you had vertically integrated. Like they designed it, they built themselves, they tested it, then installed it in modules and sold it. And that's been decentralized. And the way it's ended up is that TSMC is basically the world's largest by far. Something like 90% of the value of semiconductor production was captured by TSMC over the past few years. But because of Taiwan's position in relationship with China, and like this talk of when is China going to try and take Taiwan back by force, that makes it creates a bigger like apart from Taiwan's status itself, that has huge knock-on implications for the global economy if TSMC is part of the sort of spoils of PRC's intervention in Taiwan. So this is kind of a useful tool in some ways for Taiwan because of how sensitive the global economy would be to any disruption to TSMC's work, is that without saying it, it can kind of signal the importance of Taiwan being defended or China being deterred from launching any attacks here. So Taiwan, as you probably expect, has been very keen to engage in kind of like this Chip 4 forum. But to some extent, although like these other actors bought into it, they are aware, like China's obviously very sensitive because this looks like Taiwan being treated like an independent state by including in this group. And so there is some concern about how far they can push this for Chip 4 alliance. But the Chip 4 alliance has been used to encourage Taiwan to get TSMC to diversify where its foundries are. And the US's CHIPS Act has provided a lot of money for TSMC to build a foundry in Arizona. And just on Tuesday, TSMC broke ground on their plant in Germany as well. So the other actors are very aware of the need to have foundries elsewhere in the world. And they're like as well as TSMC, they're trying to encourage their own firms to establish foundries, but TSMC are far and away the most advanced in that space. So we can see, I'm not going to go into details, but Taiwan's policy changes, they moved very quickly to impose sort of export controls. I suppose they are in some ways, but export controls that mirror in many ways what the US wants and what the US is doing. And this is where Europe comes in. You may have heard of ASML, but basically it's the most advanced company in terms of building machines that make semiconductors. So yeah, the machines that make the tiny machines, essentially. China's main fabricator, SMIC, relies on ASML machines. TSMC relies on ASML machines. There are a bunch of other companies that produce less advanced machines, and that's fine. But if you want to be at the cutting edge of semiconductor production, which everyone does, then you need ASML machines. But we've somehow ended up in a situation where only one company in the world is capable of producing this. It has a plant in Netherlands. It has another smaller one in California. as well. So, and this is kind of where it goes against my coalition building thing and try and work out how to reconcile this, because it worked at the EU level, particularly with the Commission of like-minded states. But the Dutch government wasn't as keen initially to follow the US line, and the US needed to exert a little bit of pressure on the Dutch government by threatening to weaponize interdependence with the Netherlands, right? So initially they shared intelligence as a sort of incentive, but they also alluded, ASML imports a lot of US tech that goes into its machines and basically said, oh, you wouldn't like to lose access to those, would you? And then ASML, their CEO, I forgot the guy's name, he's really interesting. He does a lot of press conferences anytime the US imposes export controls. It basically comes out and very grumpily says, I guess we have to go along with that then, because like China was a massive market for ASML. And although most of the machines are going elsewhere, they've not been happy with the position they've been pushed into, but they've kind of complied with it along the way. But the US has increasingly tried to impose controls. And over time, initially, the US just wanted to control export of the most advanced machines to China. It's now trying to extend them to all the machines that ASML builds. Even though China has many of these in place, they just physically don't want China to have as many to slow down production as far as possible. And then there's been changes to the foreign direct products rule. It used to be that the US considered to be within their jurisdiction if any technologies included US inputs above 25% of total components. They've recently drawn that down to 0%, which is insane. But they're just saying we have, if we think that company would pose a security threat to us by giving its technology to a Chinese company, then we have the capacity to say we don't want you to be doing that, yeah. Anyway, so the US is weaponizing its position in supply chain vis-a-vis a specific firm based in an allied country, which kind of cuts against my idea of coalition building, whereas the rest of the time the US has been seeking legitimacy. More recently, the Dutch government has been sort of a lot more amenable to the US position. It's entered into a trilateral agreement with US and Japan as well. So the EU, and particularly the Commission, has tried to push forward greater cooperation that looks a lot like what the US wants to do. The EU did try to impose EU-level export controls. They tried to drop a regulation, but that was rejected by member states. My co-author, Alistair, he wrote the section on the EU's export control development in the paper, and he starts it by saying EU export controls are weird because they're about trade, so they fall within exclusive EU competence, but it's about national security for member states, which is entirely their prerogative. So they're trying to regulate what member states decide are in their own security. So it's kind of, I guess, a form of paternalism in that regard. But at the moment, the EU relies on existing dual-use controls, but that doesn't extend to the most advanced semiconductor technologies. So there's a bit of discrepancy between what the Commission wants to do and what a bunch of the member states want to do. So there has been efforts at the EU level to take more offensive steps towards China, but they haven't gone through it. And the Commission has made a lot of noise about this and trying to argue that it does have a role in security because these technologies are part of the single market, so the decision of one country affects another. If one country decides to impose export controls, firms within it could export it to another European country or a firm in another European country, and they could then export. So the EU does think there's a prerogative for the Commission to set these rules. And there's been talk about outbound FDI screening. The EU now has an inbound FDI screening mechanism to stop Chinese firms buying up sensitive technologies in Europe. But there's nothing to stop European firms investing in China, and the EU has tried that. Again, it's been pushed back by member states. So there's a bunch of policies that are defensive as well as ripping out Chinese technology, blocking it from being used. Almost all the countries have now put in place economic programs in their industrial policy to boost their domestic semiconductor industries. And they're not going back to, it's like there's been some of the literature has kind of posited techno-nationalism, which it's farmer protectionism. But I think what's interesting in each of these is that there's incentives for foreign companies to come to there, and in some cases, incentives for domestic companies to invest in friendly countries as well. So this is the kind of the strategy of friendshoring. So nobody's trying to isolate themselves, but they're trying to cut China out and to integrate their own more. Where China's posed a problem recently is that a Huawei phone that was released in the market, not with a lot of fanfare last year, when tech specialists broke this phone down, they discovered that the main integrated circuit chip designed by Huawei and produced by SMIC was more advanced than even Western intelligence services thought China could domestically produce at the moment. And this has led them to think a lot more about the problem that China may have achieved a level of tech autonomy at the moment, and that changes the game in terms of semiconductor production. But in some ways, and this outcome was predicted by the CEO of ASML when the US last summer expanded its export controls. He was interviewed, I think it was on like Bloomberg TV or something, and he just said, like, what's going to happen is China's going to find a way to innovate in its own. You're forcing them into a position where they're going to innovate faster than they would have if they're just buying your tech. So you don't actually know their capabilities, whereas if you're trading up to them, you know what they have and you know the limits of their capabilities. And within a few months, it seemed that he was proven right. So there's been a lot more attention because essentially the export controls aren't working if China is actually ahead of this. And it was also the fact that China didn't really make a big deal of this, or Huawei didn't make a big deal of their chip breakthrough. They just kind of put the phone in the market and then waited for the West to find out themselves. But so where I think the EU's contribution, kind of coming back to wider implications, is that this kind of was a testing ground for the idea of decoupling for a little while. And like Trump talked about economic decoupling, nobody really bought into that idea for very long. So then they shifted to technological decoupling and come up with a few initiatives. But this rhetoric, particularly decoupling, was explicitly rejected by the US's allies that wanted to buy into decoupling. Instead, what happened was in 2023, Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission President, gave a speech and she set out this idea of de-risking, identifying risks in supply chains and critical infrastructure and removing those risks while maintaining the rest of the economic relationship. And after this, other states, including the US, started copying the de-risking strategy. So the EU ended up providing a frame of reference for policies, and essentially still the same policies when it comes to technology, right? It's cutting China out, improving your own technological development. But the language that has been adopted has allowed the US to legitimately sell its changes to other actors, and they're now buying into it and now forming this Chip 4 alliance. And we see this quite clearly with the Biden administration. The Biden administration has said that they're not pursuing full economic decoupling with China. And like the meeting last year between Biden and Xi in November, and then the follow-up phone call, they've talked about where they're going to cooperate, where they're going to collaborate economically in science and technology, but identifying risks and trying to build resilience. So I think this has been the EU's role, and this is why the EU has projected power into the East Asian region by giving that legitimate frame that others have started to buy into. And this has boosted, although the EU hasn't been able to agree on a common set of export controls, doesn't have the outbound FDI screening mechanism. It's played a social role in helping the US achieve its objectives of getting greater buy-in from, well, Japan and Taiwan were right there, but South Korea in particular reaction to China's behavior there. So I realize I've leathered on for quite a while, but I do think that China is becoming more assertive in its ambition to become a tech superpower and in securing its own interests via its tech firms. I haven't really talked about this, but there is a lot of evidence that China is using a lot of state resources to get Huawei to the position as like the state capitalist model. And that's not particularly surprising, but it is allowing China to reshape the tech order. And in some ways, the industrial policy changes of the US and the other actors are a direct response to China's state capitalist model, working well enough to get Huawei into a position where its technology was good and economically competitive. When I spoke to European officials about why Huawei technology stayed in European networks for so long, the answer I got from interviews was because it was good tech and it was comparable to Ericsson and Nokia in quality, if not better, and often cheaper. So like the model worked in that sense, and industrial policies are a reaction to that. So this has all come off the back of a fear of weaponized interdependence, first with respect to Huawei, and then more generally looking at China's role in the semiconductor supply chain. China has adopted offensive moves by setting up this framework for critical mineral export restrictions. but it's also tried defensive tactics by trying to use the rules of the WTO. But there's no movement and dispute mechanism at the WTO at the moment because the US's decisions around appellate judges. But nevertheless, China still sees value in using the WTO strategically when it wants to, in order to try and rein in US power. And it's also, China has recently also boosted significant financial support even more to its own domestic industry in response to being threatened to cut. But the US has also become more assertive in East Asia as well around the supply chains. It has moved from an open trade system of semiconductors that it helped create, or basically created on its own, and it's now saying no, there is a regulatory role for the state to decide what firms can and cannot do, including foreign firms, in the name of our national security interests. It's engaged in, like, these are obviously US allies anyway, but it's building a new technology coalition for its preferred order, specifically for trade around semiconductors. But this has implications for the reshaping the regional order because it will curtail, notionally, it will curtail China's technological development. But it changes the relations between these actors in China as well, because they are economically interdependent with China too. And they may, at some point, bear the economic costs of imposing these restrictions. But seemingly, some of them are willing to run that risk at the moment to buy into the system. But on both sides of the US and China, we do still see selective cooperation. And Biden's talked a lot about putting a floor under the relationship, and they've emphasized areas where they're going to work together. They have their bilateral science and technology cooperation agreement, which dates back to the 70s and expired last year. And they've given it 2 temporary reprieves. I think they're due this month to decide whether they're going to do it as well or not. But around that agreement, both the US and China talked a lot about the importance of science and technology cooperation, and recognizing that although there are challenges and legitimate security concerns, essentially for both sides, that bigger questions like climate change are still going to need the US and China to cooperate. So there's those kind of bigger order questions that they want to. And other actors are keen to compartmentalize the chip war with China if they can, in order to maintain wider economic engagement. So then, I just kind of put these offensive and defensive moves in a table to try and help myself more than anything. But so I think this technological competition is going to continue to be increasingly more important. I can't find the original source for this, and it's really annoying because I need to reference it properly. But I saw semiconductors described as the crude oil of the digital age. I think that's really good. And then the other day I read, and I've got the reference for that, someone referred to Chip 4 as the start of an OPEC-like cartel for semiconductor controls going forward. And I think, at some point, there's obviously technological limitations just by pure laws of physics as to how advanced semiconductors can eventually become. But until we reach that point, the competition to be at the leading edge is going to be important for wider economic power, for military power, and also for international prestige as well. And at the level of networks, we're going to continue to see states looking to change the rules of the game. And what we might see is increased emergence of tech silos, where it's like-minded partners, not just particular countries, are within these. And I think if you've read Anya Bradford's Digital Empire, she talked about information silos as well, where instead of the techno-optimism of the 80s and 90s, where, humanity would be brought together by sharing information through the internet, is what we're going to have is information silos. And that will be partly a response to the threat of disinformation and propaganda being projected into each other's networks as well. So I think what's happening here in the semiconductor is not just about material power, it's about the social legitimacy and the buy-in to particular rules and the ordering processes that are underway. But that's it. Thank you very much for your attention. I realize I've talked for nearly an hour there. So thanks for your patience.